Sarah Martinez never thought her military training would save her life in a grocery store parking lot on a quiet Tuesday evening. She had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine combat engineer, defusing bombs and navigating hostile territory where split-second decisions meant the difference between coming home or coming home in a flag-draped coffin. But that was overseas, in a war zone. This was supposed to be safe. This was supposed to be home. At 5'4" inches with shoulder-length brown hair and wearing scrubs after a 12-hour shift at the local hospital, Sarah looked like any other tired healthcare worker picking up dinner ingredients. The 3 men who had been watching her from across the parking lot saw an easy target. They saw someone small, alone, and distracted by her phone as she walked toward her Honda Civic with grocery bags in both hands. What they didn't see was the woman who had spent months in Helmand Province where every shadow could hide an enemy and every moment of inattention could be your last. They didn't know about the muscle memory burned into her nervous system through countless hours of combat training, or the lightning-fast reflexes that had kept her alive when roadside bombs shattered the desert air around her convoy. In 2 seconds, their predatory confidence would meet the reality of what happens when you corner someone who has been trained to fight back by the world's most elite military force. In 2 seconds, 3 criminals would learn why Marines are called devil dogs. In 2 seconds, everything would change. Sarah Martinez pulled into the parking space at Wilson's Market just as the sun began to set behind the strip mall. Her white Honda Civic looked ordinary among the scattered cars in the lot, and she felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settling into her shoulders after another long shift at Memorial Hospital. The emergency room had been particularly brutal today, with 3 car accident victims and a construction worker who had fallen from scaffolding. Her scrubs still carried the faint smell of antiseptic and stress. She grabbed her phone from the passenger seat and scrolled through her grocery list while sitting in the car. Chicken breast, vegetables for stir-fry, yogurt, and coffee. Simple things. Normal things. The kind of mundane errands that reminded her she was no longer in a place where the nearest grocery store was a 3-hour convoy ride through hostile territory. 3 months had passed since Sarah returned from her second deployment in Afghanistan. 3 months of adjusting to civilian life, to a world where car backfires didn't make everyone dive for cover, where crowds of people were just crowds of people instead of potential threats to be assessed and cataloged. Her therapist at the VA hospital called it hypervigilance, this constant scanning of her environment, this automatic threat assessment that her mind performed without her conscious permission. She was working on it. The parking lot of Wilson's Market seemed safe enough. A few families loading groceries into minivans, an elderly man pushing a cart toward his sedan, a woman with 2 small children hurrying toward the store entrance. Normal people living normal lives in the small Illinois town where Sarah had grown up. The same town she had dreamed of returning to during those long, hot nights in Afghanistan when mortar rounds whistled overhead, and she wondered if she would ever feel safe again. She locked her car and walked toward the store, her keys jingling softly in her hand. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical whisper, and cool air conditioning washed over her face. The familiar sounds of a grocery store surrounded her. Shopping carts rolling across linoleum, the beep of checkout scanners, quiet conversations between shoppers comparing prices and products. Sarah grabbed a small cart and moved through the aisles with efficient purpose. Military training had taught her to be methodical, to have a plan and execute it without wasting time or motion. She selected organic chicken breast from the meat counter, picked out fresh vegetables from the produce section, and grabbed a container of Greek yogurt from the dairy case. The routine felt comforting, normal in a way that still surprised her after months of adjustment. At the coffee aisle, she paused in front of the overwhelming array of options. Dark roast, medium roast, flavored blends, single origin beans. In Afghanistan, coffee had come in 2 varieties, strong or stronger. She smiled to herself and reached for a bag of Colombian dark roast, the same brand her father had drunk every morning before heading to his job at the power plant. The checkout line moved quickly. The cashier, a teenager with purple streaks in her hair, made small talk about the weather while scanning Sarah's items. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Sarah of the Afghan horizon. Though here there were no guard towers or razor wire to interrupt the view. She paid with cash, gathered her bags, and pushed through the exit doors into the warm evening air. The parking lot was quieter now, with fewer shoppers coming and going. Her car sat in the same spot where she had left it, 30 yards away across the asphalt. She pulled out her phone and started walking, intending to check her messages from her sister, who had been texting updates about their father's upcoming birthday party. This was the moment when everything began to go wrong, though Sarah wouldn't realize it for another few seconds. She was focused on her phone screen, reading a message about cake flavors and party decorations, when 3 men stepped out from behind a large pickup truck parked 2 spaces away from her car. They had been waiting, watching, planning. The first man was tall and thin, wearing a dirty baseball cap, pulled low over his eyes. The second was shorter but broader, with arms covered in faded tattoos and hands that looked like they had seen their share of violence. The third hung back slightly, younger than the other 2, nervous energy radiating from his posture as he glanced around the parking lot. Sarah's military-trained peripheral vision caught the movement before her conscious mind processed the threat. 3 men, moving with purpose, positioning themselves to block her path to her car. The familiar sensation of danger assessment kicked in automatically, her nervous system shifting into a state of heightened awareness that she had hoped never to need again. She looked up from her phone, grocery bags in both hands, and found herself facing 3 strangers whose body language screamed predator. They were close enough that she could see the details of their faces, the way their eyes calculated her size and apparent vulnerability, the way they spread out to prevent her from simply walking around them. The tall man spoke first, his voice carrying the practiced casualness of someone who had done this before. "Hey there, sweetheart. Looks like you could use some help with those bags." Sarah's training kicked in with crystal clarity. Assess the threat. Identify escape routes. Prepare for contact. The muscle memory of countless combat scenarios flooded back, overlaying the grocery store parking lot with the tactical awareness that had kept her alive in a war zone. She was outnumbered 3-1. They had positioned themselves strategically, cutting off her direct route to her car. The parking lot was mostly empty now, with the nearest other people far enough away that calling for help might not bring assistance quickly enough. Her hands were occupied with grocery bags, limiting her ability to defend herself or reach for her phone. But Sarah Martinez was not the helpless victim these men thought they had found. She was a United States Marine who had survived 2 combat deployments, who had been trained to fight and win against overwhelming odds, who had faced down enemies with automatic weapons and improvised explosive devices. 3 criminals in a grocery store parking lot had just made the worst mistake of their lives. The shorter man with the tattoos stepped closer, and Sarah could smell alcohol on his breath mixed with stale cigarettes. "We're not going to hurt you if you cooperate," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "I just need you to come with us for a minute. Have a little conversation." Sarah's mind raced through her options with the speed and precision of someone whose survival had once depended on making the right choice in microseconds. She could drop the bags and run, but they would likely catch her before she reached safety. She could scream for help, but the nearest people were too far away. She could comply and hope they only wanted money, but everything about their demeanor suggested their intentions went far beyond robbery. Or she could do what Marines do when cornered by the enemy. She could fight. The younger man, the one hanging back, kept glancing nervously toward the store entrance. "Come on, let's just get this over with," he muttered to his companions. Too many people around, but the tall man seemed to be enjoying himself. He stepped even closer to Sarah, close enough that she could see the yellow stains on his teeth when he smiled. "What's the matter, honey? Cat got your tongue?" Sarah looked directly into his eyes and spoke for the first time since the encounter began. Her voice was calm, steady, carrying no trace of the fear these men expected to hear. "You need to step aside and let me pass." The 3 men exchanged glances, and the tattooed one laughed. "Or what? You gonna call the cops?" He gestured mockingly at her scrubs. "What are you, a nurse? You gonna take our temperature?" They had no idea they were about to learn exactly what Sarah Martinez was capable of when pushed into a corner. The grocery bags in her hands felt heavy, but not as heavy as the M4 carbine she had carried through the mountains of Afghanistan. The 3 men closing in around her seemed threatening, but not as threatening as Taliban fighters who wanted nothing more than to kill her and everyone in her unit. Sarah Martinez had been trained by the best military in the world to survive and overcome. She had been forged in the crucible of combat, tested under fire, and proven capable of doing whatever it took to protect herself and others. These three criminals were about to discover what happened when predators chose the wrong prey. The tall man reached out with his right hand, intending to grab Sarah's arm. As his fingers extended toward her, time seemed to slow down. Sarah's combat training took over completely, her body moving with the precision and speed of someone who had drilled these movements thousands of times until they became as natural as breathing. In the next 2 seconds, three criminals would learn why you never corner a Marine. The moment the tall man's hand moved towards Sarah's arm, her Marine training exploded into action. 2 years of combat experience and thousands of hours of close-quarters combat training compressed into a single heartbeat of devastating efficiency. Sarah dropped both grocery bags simultaneously, letting them fall to the asphalt with a crash of breaking eggs and scattering vegetables. Before the tall man's fingers could make contact with her scrubs, she stepped forward into his reach, rather than backing away, violating his expectation and disrupting his balance. Her right hand shot upward in a textbook palm strike, driving the heel of her palm into his nose with all the force her 5'4" frame could generate. The sound was sickening and unmistakable. Cartilage crunched, blood exploded across his face, and the tall man's head snapped backward as his hands instinctively flew to his shattered nose. He stumbled backward, crying out in shocked pain and rage, blood streaming between his fingers. The tattooed man, who had been standing slightly to Sarah's left, reacted with the delayed reflexes of someone who had consumed too much alcohol before deciding to commit crimes. He lunged toward her with a wild haymaker punch, telegraphing his intention so clearly that Sarah had plenty of time to respond. She ducked under his swing, letting his momentum carry him off balance, then drove her left elbow upward into his solar plexus with precision that would have made her drill instructors proud. The blow landed exactly where she intended, directly below his ribcage, forcing all the air from his lungs in an explosive whoosh of pain and surprise. As the tattooed man doubled over, gasping and wheezing, Sarah grabbed the back of his head with both hands and drove her knee upward into his face. The impact was brutal and decisive. His head snapped back, eyes rolling white, and he collapsed to the asphalt like a marionette with severed strings, unconscious before he hit the ground. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. 2 men were down, one bleeding profusely from his broken nose, and the other completely unconscious. The younger man, who had been hanging back nervously, stared in absolute shock at the sudden transformation of what should have been an easy victim into something resembling a tornado of controlled violence. Sarah turned to face him, her posture and expression radiating the calm confidence of someone who had just done exactly what she had been trained to do. Her breathing was steady, her stance balanced and ready for continued combat. To the younger man, she no longer looked like a tired nurse in scrubs. She looked like exactly what she was, a combat veteran who had survived 2 tours in a war zone and was prepared to do whatever it took to survive this encounter. The tall man was still on his feet, though barely. Blood continued to pour from his ruined nose, and his eyes were watering so badly he could hardly see. But rage and wounded pride drove him to make one more desperate attempt at salvaging the situation. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folding knife, flicking it open with a metallic click that rang across the parking lot. "You crazy bitch," he snarled through his broken nose, his words thick and nasal from the blood. "I'm gonna cut you up for that." Sarah saw the knife and felt a familiar surge of combat adrenaline, the same feeling she had experienced when Taliban fighters opened fire on her convoy, or when she spotted the telltale signs of an improvised explosive device buried in a dirt road. But this was different. This wasn't Afghanistan, where rules of engagement and military protocol governed every action. This was a parking lot in Illinois, where 3 criminals had chosen to threaten her, and she was free to respond with whatever level of force necessary to protect herself. The man with the knife advanced on her in a clumsy rush, slashing wildly with the blade. His technique was terrible, the desperate flailing of someone who thought having a weapon automatically made him dangerous. Sarah had been trained to disarm enemies who actually knew how to use knives effectively. This was almost insultingly easy. She sidestepped his first wild swing, grabbed his wrist with her left hand, and drove her right elbow into his forearm just above the joint. The leverage and force of the blow caused his hand to open involuntarily, sending the knife clattering across the asphalt and under a nearby car. Before he could react, Sarah spun him around and applied a blood choke, wrapping her right arm around his throat and cutting off the blood flow to his brain. In military combat training, Sarah had learned that a properly applied blood choke could render someone unconscious in 3 to 5 seconds. The tall man thrashed and struggled for exactly 4 seconds before his body went limp and he slumped to the ground, unconscious, but alive. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds. 3 men who had approached what they thought was an easy victim now lay on the asphalt, 2 unconscious and 1 with a broken nose, while Sarah stood over them, breathing steadily and scanning the parking lot for additional threats. The younger man, who had witnessed the entire sequence with growing horror, finally found his voice. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, backing away from Sarah with his hands raised. "What the hell are you?" Sarah looked at him calmly, her training keeping her alert for any sign that he might try to continue the fight. "United States Marine Corps," she said simply, "and you need to stay right where you are." The young man's face went pale as the implications hit him. He had just watched a woman in nursing scrubs dismantle 2 grown men with the efficiency of a professional fighter. His 2 companions lay unconscious on the ground, and he was suddenly very aware that he was alone with someone who had just demonstrated capabilities far beyond anything he had imagined possible. "Look, I'm sorry," he stammered, still backing away. "This wasn't my idea. I just drove them here. I wasn't gonna hurt anybody." Sarah pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911, keeping her eyes on the young man while she waited for the operator to answer. Around the parking lot, other shoppers had begun to notice the commotion. An elderly couple loading groceries into their car had stopped to stare. A woman with 2 children had frozen near the store entrance, uncertain whether to approach or retreat. 911, what's your emergency?" The operator's voice was calm and professional. "This is Sarah Martinez at Wilson's Market on Oak Street," Sarah replied, her voice steady and clear. "I need police and paramedics. 3 men attempted to assault me in the parking lot. 2 are unconscious, 1 has a broken nose, and 1 is uninjured but was involved in the incident." The operator asked several quick questions about injuries and weapons, and Sarah provided precise, factual answers while keeping her attention divided between the phone conversation and the young man who had stopped backing away but was looking increasingly desperate. The tall man with the broken nose was beginning to stir, groaning and moving his head slightly. The tattooed man remained completely unconscious, though Sarah could see his chest rising and falling steadily. Her training had taught her to use exactly enough force to neutralize threats without causing permanent injury when possible, and she was satisfied that both men would recover fully from their encounter with Marine Corps combat training. Within minutes, the wail of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder as police and paramedics responded to Sarah's call. The young man heard them too and made a decision that probably saved his life. Instead of running or trying to help his companions, he sat down on the ground and put his hands on his head. "I surrender," he called out to Sarah. "I'm not moving. Just don't hurt me." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Smart choice," she said. The first police car arrived with lights flashing, followed quickly by 2 more patrol units and an ambulance. Officers approached with weapons drawn but lowered, their training and experience helping them quickly assess the situation. They saw a woman in nursing scrubs standing calmly beside 3 men on the ground, 2 unconscious and 1 bleeding from his nose. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran of the police force, took charge of the scene. He had seen plenty of fights and assaults during his career, but the aftermath of this encounter was unlike anything in his experience. The precision and efficiency of the injuries suggested someone with serious combat training, yet the woman standing over the 3 suspects looked like she had just finished a shift at the hospital. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Rodriguez," he said, approaching Sarah with professional courtesy. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine, Sergeant," Sarah replied. "I'm a registered nurse, and I can tell you that both unconscious men have pulses and are breathing normally. The one with the broken nose needs medical attention but isn't in immediate danger." As paramedics began assessing the injured men, Sarah provided a clear, detailed account of what had happened. She described how the three men had approached her, blocked her path to her car, made threatening statements, and then initiated physical contact that had forced her to defend herself. Sergeant Rodriguez listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. Other officers interviewed witnesses who had seen portions of the encounter, and their statements corroborated Sarah's account. The elderly couple confirmed that they had seen three men surrounding Sarah near her car. The woman with children had witnessed the actual fight and described how quickly and efficiently Sarah had dealt with her attackers. "Ma'am," Sergeant Rodriguez said when he finished taking her statement, "can I ask about your background? Because what you did here tonight isn't something most people could have pulled off." Sarah handed him her military ID card along with her driver's license. "2 tours in Afghanistan with the Marines," she said. "Combat engineer. I've been back stateside for 3 months." The sergeant examined her identification and nodded with understanding. "That explains a lot," he said. "You probably saved yourself from something much worse than robbery tonight." As the paramedics loaded the unconscious men into ambulances and the police arrested all 3 suspects, Sarah realized she was shaking slightly, not from fear or shock, but from the adrenaline finally leaving her system. She had been in combat mode for the past 20 minutes, her body and mind operating at peak efficiency, and now the chemical aftermath was catching up with her. One of the paramedics, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, noticed Sarah's trembling hands. "Honey, why don't you let me check you out?" she offered. "Sometimes the adrenaline crash can be rough." Sarah accepted the offer gratefully, sitting on the back bumper of the ambulance while the paramedic checked her blood pressure and pulse. Everything was normal, just elevated from the stress and excitement of the confrontation. As police finished collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses, word of the incident began to spread through the small town. Sarah's phone started buzzing with text messages from friends and coworkers who had heard about what happened. The story was already growing in the telling, with some versions claiming she had fought off 5 attackers, others suggesting the men had been armed with guns. But Sarah Martinez knew the truth was remarkable enough without embellishment. 3 criminals had chosen the wrong victim, and her Marine training had given her the tools to protect herself when it mattered most. She had survived another dangerous encounter, this time not in Afghanistan but in the place she called home. The confrontation was over, but its aftermath was just beginning. By the time Sarah arrived home 2 hours later, her phone had received 43 text messages, 12 missed calls, and 6 voicemails. Word traveled fast in a small town, especially when it involved a local nurse taking down 3 attackers in a grocery store parking lot with the precision of an action movie hero. Her sister Maria had heard the news from a friend whose cousin worked dispatch at the police department. Her father had gotten a call from his neighbor who had seen the ambulances and police cars at Wilson's Market. Her colleagues at Memorial Hospital were buzzing with rumors that ranged from accurate accounts to wildly exaggerated tales of Sarah single-handedly fighting off an entire gang. Sarah sat in her living room, still wearing the same scrubs she had worn during her shift at the hospital and the encounter in the parking lot. She had intended to change clothes as soon as she got home, but the constant stream of phone calls and messages had made it impossible to find a quiet moment. She felt exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, the kind of deep fatigue that came after surviving something that could have gone very differently. Her father arrived first, letting himself in with the spare key she had given him when she moved back home from the military. Robert Martinez was a quiet man who had raised 2 daughters on his own after their mother died in a car accident when Sarah was 12. He had worried constantly during her deployments to Afghanistan, checking the news obsessively for reports of casualties, and counting the days until each tour was over. "Mija," he said, using the Spanish nickname he had called her since childhood, "are you okay?" Sarah stood up and hugged her father tightly, feeling some of the tension leave her body in the safety of his embrace. "I'm fine, Dad. Really. Just tired." Robert held her at arm's length, studying her face with the careful attention of a parent who had learned to read his daughter's moods through letters and video calls during 2 combat deployments. "The police called me. They said 3 men tried to rob you." "It wasn't exactly a robbery, Dad," Sarah said, settling back onto the couch. "I think they had something else in mind." Her father's expression darkened as the implications sank in. He had served in the army himself during the Gulf War, and he understood the difference between criminals looking for money and predators hunting for victims. "Tell me what happened." Sarah recounted the evening's events, describing the approach of the three men, their threatening behavior, and the brief but decisive fight that followed. She kept the details clinical and factual, the way she had been trained to give after-action reports in the military. But she could see the pride and concern warring in her father's eyes as she described how her Marine training had saved her life. 2 tours in Afghanistan, Robert said when she finished, and you come home to get attacked in a grocery store parking lot. Life doesn't make much sense sometimes. Before Sarah could respond, her sister Maria burst through the front door without knocking, followed closely by her husband Carlos and their 2 young children. Maria was 3 years older than Sarah, and had always been the more emotional of the 2 sisters. She rushed to Sarah and wrapped her in a fierce hug. "Don't you ever scare us like that again," Maria said, her voice thick with tears she was trying not to shed. "When I heard what happened, I thought I was going to have a heart attack." Sarah's nephew Tommy, age 8, looked up at her with wide eyes full of admiration and curiosity. "Aunt Sarah, did you really beat up 3 bad guys?" "When someone tries to hurt you, it's okay to protect yourself." "Like a superhero?" his 6-year-old sister Elena asked. "Like a soldier," Sarah corrected gently. "Sometimes soldiers have to fight to protect themselves and other people." Carlos, who worked construction and had served briefly in the National Guard, shook his head in amazement. 3 against 1 and you put 2 of them in the hospital. That's some serious training you got in the Marines. Over the next hour, Sarah's living room filled with visitors. Her supervisor from the hospital arrived with flowers and genuine concern about whether Sarah would be comfortable returning to work. Several of her Marine buddies who lived in the area came by after hearing about the incident through the veteran network that seemed to know everything that happened to former service members within a 100-mile radius. Detective Lisa Chen from the police department stopped by to inform Sarah that all 3 men had been charged with attempted assault and that the one with the knife faced additional charges for assault with a deadly weapon. The investigation had revealed that the trio had been responsible for several robberies in the area over the past 2 months, though Sarah appeared to be their first intended victim who had fought back successfully. "The district attorney wants to know if you're willing to testify," Detective Chen explained. "With the evidence we have and the witness statements, it's pretty much an open and shut case. But your testimony would help ensure they get the maximum sentence." Sarah didn't hesitate. "Absolutely, whatever you need." As the evening wore on and the visitors gradually departed, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time since the confrontation. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat on her back porch, looking out at the quiet neighborhood where she had grown up and returned to after her military service. The physical confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds, but its emotional impact was more complex and lasting. Sarah felt proud of how her training had served her when it mattered most. She felt grateful that she had survived another dangerous encounter and could continue living the peaceful life she had earned through her military service. But she also felt a familiar sadness at being reminded that the skills she had hoped never to use again might always be necessary in a world that contained predators who targeted the vulnerable. Her phone rang, breaking the quiet of the evening. The caller ID showed the number for Dr. Patricia Williams, the therapist she had been seeing at the VA hospital to help with her transition from military to civilian life. "Sarah, I heard what happened tonight," Dr. Williams said. "How are you doing?" "I'm okay," Sarah replied, and realized she meant it. "Better than I expected, actually. I imagine this brought up some complicated feelings. Do you want to talk about it?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "It was different from Afghanistan," she said finally. "Over there, the danger was random. IEDs, sniper fire, mortar attacks. You never knew when or where it might come from. But tonight felt more personal. These men specifically chose me because they thought I was vulnerable." "And how do you feel about the way you responded?" "Proud," Sarah said without hesitation. "And grateful that my training worked the way it was supposed to, but also a little sad that it was necessary." They talked for another 20 minutes about trauma, survival, and the challenge of integrating military skills with civilian life. Dr. Williams reminded Sarah that her response had been proportional and appropriate, that she had used exactly enough force to neutralize the threat without causing permanent injury to her attackers. After ending the call, Sarah remained on the porch as darkness settled over the neighborhood. Streetlights flickered on, and she could hear the distant sounds of normal evening life. Televisions playing in living rooms, children being called inside for baths, dogs barking at passing cars. This was the life she had fought to protect during her deployments to Afghanistan. This quiet, peaceful existence where people could go to grocery stores without expecting to be attacked, where children could play in yards without fear, where the biggest daily concern might be choosing between different brands of coffee. But Sarah now understood more clearly than ever that peace and safety were not guaranteed. They were maintained by the vigilance and courage of people willing to stand up to those who would prey on the innocent. Her military service had taught her to defend freedom and democracy on a global scale. Tonight had taught her that sometimes the most important battles were fought in grocery store parking lots against criminals who thought they had found an easy victim. 3 days later, Sarah returned to work at Memorial Hospital. Her colleagues treated her like a celebrity at first, asking for details about the fight and expressing amazement at her combat skills. But the novelty wore off quickly, and soon she was back to her routine of 12-hour shifts, emergency room drama, and the satisfying work of helping people heal from illness and injury. The incident report she filed with hospital security was brief and professional. The local newspaper ran a small story about the arrests, mentioning that the 3 suspects had been overpowered by their intended victim, but not providing details about Sarah's military background or combat training. She preferred it that way. 2 months later, Sarah stood in a courthouse and testified against the 3 men who had attacked her. The tall man with the broken nose, whose name was Derek Morrison, had a criminal record stretching back 15 years. The tattooed man, Michael Santos, had served time for armed robbery and assault. The younger man, Kevin Wright, was a first-time offender who had fallen in with the wrong crowd and made the worst decision of his life. All 3 pled guilty to avoid trial. Morrison and Santos received sentences of 5 to 7 years in state prison. Wright, who cooperated with prosecutors and testified against his co-defendants, received 3 years probation and community service. During the sentencing hearing, Sarah was allowed to make a victim impact statement. She stood before the judge and spoke clearly about how the attack had affected her, how it had brought back memories of combat stress she had been working to overcome, and how her military training had probably saved her from much worse injuries than the men had ultimately received. But she also spoke about forgiveness and the hope that all 3 men would use their time in prison or probation to make better choices in the future. She had seen enough violence and destruction in Afghanistan to know that hatred and revenge were corrosive emotions that hurt the person carrying them more than their intended targets. After the hearing, Detective Chen approached Sarah in the courthouse hallway. "I've been a cop for 12 years, she said, "and I've never seen anyone handle a situation like you did. You should consider applying to the police department. We could use someone with your skills and training." Sarah smiled and thanked her for the offer, but she knew her path led elsewhere. She had found purpose and satisfaction in her work as a nurse, helping people heal and recover from the traumas and injuries that life inflicted on them. It was a different kind of service than she had provided as a Marine, but it was service nonetheless. 6 months after the parking lot confrontation, Sarah Martinez received a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It was a formal commendation recognizing her actions in defending herself and noting that her conduct reflected favorably on the Marine Corps and the United States military. The letter would become part of her permanent military record, a small acknowledgement of a moment when her training had served her well in an unexpected situation. Sarah framed the letter and hung it on the wall of her home office, next to her discharge certificate and the medals she had earned during her deployments to Afghanistan. But the real reward wasn't official recognition or media attention. It was the simple fact that she was alive, safe, and free to continue building the peaceful life she had earned through her service to her country. Late at night, when she couldn't sleep, Sarah sometimes thought about the 2 seconds that had changed everything in that parking lot. 2 seconds when her Marine training had taken over and turned her from victim to victor. 2 seconds that had demonstrated the value of every hour of combat training, every drill, every lesson her instructors had pounded into her during boot camp and advanced infantry training. She was proud of those 2 seconds and grateful for the men and women who had prepared her for them. But she was even more grateful for all the peaceful moments that had followed, moments when she could simply be Sarah Martinez, registered nurse, daughter, sister, and proud veteran who had earned the right to live without fear in the country she had served with honor and distinction. The 3 men who had closed in around her that evening had learned a valuable lesson about choosing their victims more carefully. Sarah Martinez had been reminded that the warrior spirit she had developed as a Marine would always be part of who she was, ready to emerge when needed to protect herself and others from those who would do harm to the innocent. In the end, justice had been served, wounds had healed, and life had returned to the peaceful rhythm that made small-town America worth defending. And Sarah Martinez slept soundly at night, knowing that she was prepared for whatever challenges might come her way.